We're going to be trying to answer this question: why don't politicians do more to tackle climate change? So I think an important question, especially what's been going on in recent weeks. Turnover in the American elections, shift to a new administration, all of a sudden a bit more energy when it comes to the question of climate change. But it feels like for decades, more could have been done that wasn't done. And so I'd like to try and work out why that might be the case and what it is about politics or politicians that perhaps sometimes prevents them from acting more on these really long-term, intractable, difficult problems. Okay, so this is a topic that is nominally about politics insofar as it's about power, and politics is just the study of power. But we're also going to be dealing with matters of economics. We'll be dealing with philosophy, and in particular, questions of justice and fairness. We'll be talking about demography. We'll be talking about geography. But this is what happens in politics, right? Politics isn't really a subject that ever stands on its own, because when you're studying power, well, power is everywhere. There'll be power in your household. There'll be power between you and your siblings. There'll be power in schools. There's power everywhere. So political scientists like me basically study everything. I think it's sometimes assumed that political science is the study of what Boris is up to at the moment. And we do that because, he's the most powerful man in the country. But we also look at this sort of stuff as well. So there we go. All right. So let's start with a little background. Now, climate change is one of these sort of multifaceted, multi-generational, big old problems that we've seen coming down the tracks for a long time. So there's you may have heard of the Milankovitch cycle. So a Serbian physicist, mathematician worked out that anthropogenic climate change was going on almost about 80, 90 years ago. So anthropogenic climate change means that climate change has been caused by people, human beings. So it's been known scientifically that this is the case for donkey's years. And yet we are only now really seriously beginning to tackle it. And even now, many people think it's far too late. And what we're doing is a bit like sort of chucking a few snowballs at an avalanche. So that begs the question as to why. Why is it that when politicians see these massive problems coming down the track, they don't do more about it? Are they just sick, evil fools that we ought to sort of just abandon? No, they're human beings, right? And so we're all capable of the same fallibility, but there must be something about the structures within which they make their decisions, the structures of power, that perhaps don't give them the incentives to do anything about these long-term problems. In other words, it would perhaps be properly foolish for a politician to do something about climate change. That's how difficult it is for them to take these difficult steps. And climate change isn't alone in being one of these intractable problems that politicians struggle to deal with. And I've got 3 examples on the screen here. So pensions, healthcare, and social care are similar policy problems that have a lot of complications to them. They have multidimensional and multi-generational facets to them that politicians knew were going to cause them trouble donkeys years ago, but they still did nothing about. Okay. Oh, sorry. I'm just going to mute everyone so that I don't get too much background noise. Hello. All right. There we go. So we start with something like pensions. The first old age pensions were introduced in Britain just before the First World War. And from that point on, everyone knew there was going to be a pensions crisis because it was just maths. It's just really basic maths. You've got an increasing number of old people, a shrinking number of young people. The young people pay for the pensions of the old people. And eventually the two were going to cross paths. Everyone knew it was coming. They knew it was coming decades in advance. But that doesn't make it easy to solve the pensions crisis. It doesn't make it easy to say to some people, right, you're going to have to pay even more in tax for your grandparents, or tell the grandparents you're going to have much less of your pension than you expected, or you're going to have to retire much later. Once you start these policies in train, they create what are called stakeholders, so people who enjoy the status quo. And they have a stake in holding on to their particular position, and they don't want to change it. So pensioners don't want to retire later. They don't want to receive less in their pension, and young people don't want to pay more in tax. So you've got just a no-win situation. The sort of guts it would take to solve that would be downright foolishness, right? A politician that says, right, I'm going to clean up the pensions crisis would lose. That's the bottom line. We don't reward people with that degree of vision and capability. And part of that is because of the structures of power. We obviously expect politicians to only be in power for about a 5-year cycle before they have to face another election. So part of the issue is, of course, that politicians have extremely short time horizons. They're not only thinking about what's going to happen in the next 5 years, they're frankly thinking about what's going to be in the papers tomorrow morning, right? And for someone with that close a time horizon, the idea of thinking about solving something that's a multi-generational problem, that's horrifying. So no one's done it, even though they knew it was going to happen. And before you start thinking, well, this is an obvious problem with democracy, and so clearly the solution is just to dump democracy and us all become authoritarian dictatorships. Well, dictators are just as bad. In fact, dictators are even worse than democrats at this sort of stuff. Because dictators similarly, in fact, dictators face an even worse legitimacy problem. And they're not only worried about what's going to happen in the next few days, they're worried about whether someone's going to, execute them. So this is not a problem that's unique to democracies at all. And some other examples, social care is another problem that we're constantly talking about, and it faces many similar dynamics. Healthcare is a really intriguing one. So, one of Wales's most famous sons, Aneurin Bevan, founded the National Health Service in 1948. And amazingly, the civil service briefs on how the National Health Service would operate predicted that healthcare would cost less every year as people got better. Now, that's kind of logical, right? Once you've set up this National Health Service program and you start basically curing people, there'll be fewer sick people and it'll cost less. Now, with hindsight, that seems ferociously naive, that they really thought that, the NHS would be cheaper every year. And now, of course, we know that it's just constantly more expensive because you start helping a few people out. And then, of course, there's new complaints they'd have to deal with. And it's almost now a sort of state authorized, policy against death. Anything that's avoidable will be done to save people's lives. So we're extending people's lives far beyond what was historically possible. So healthcare is another problem where we're almost the victims of our own successes. The system is so good, it's curing so many people that it's becoming vastly more expensive. So, basic point is that there are some policy spaces that are what in the jargon we would call a wicked problem. There's just no obvious way that you can pull together the resources, the people, the powers to solve these problems, because no one would win if you tried. And climate change is in that space. It's a similar thing where even to try and solve it would probably lead to you as an individual being punished for it. So no one has an incentive to do anything about it. But before we sort of get into the nitty gritty of it, we need to deconstruct the question a bit. And this is a good idea. So whenever you're confronted with an essay question or an interview question, it's a really good idea to start by just tearing the question to pieces, deconstruct it. As if you've got, a cake and you're trying to work out what are all the ingredients in this cake. You've got a question here. You've got to work out what are all the ingredients in this question. I'm going to pull it apart. Okay, so why don't politicians do more to tackle climate change was the question. And what I'm suggesting is that you unleash your inner toddler, because a toddler would say things like, well, what are politicians? And what do you mean by tackle climate change? And what is climate change? They would do that sort of deconstructive analysis that sometimes we don't do as adults because we maybe take it for granted. So let's play the role of a toddler for a second. So first of all, have politicians in fact failed to tackle climate change? Do they not tackle climate change? Is the underlying assumption of this question in any way reasonable? It might be that we're getting off from the wrong foot by assuming that politicians haven't done enough to tackle climate change when maybe they've been doing more than could be expected given all of the incentive problems that I've just been talking about. So that would be the first thing to bear in mind. Okay. And then we've got the notion of politicians. Well, which politicians? We can't realistically say that all politicians have failed to acknowledge climate change. So we're talking about a subset of politicians. So presumably those ones with government power and authority, presumably they are the ones that are most liable for the difficulties that we're facing in terms of climate change. Okay. But then you can be even more conceptual than that, right? My inner toddler is screaming at me and saying not only which politicians, but what even are politicians? Are politicians just a sort of an extension of ourselves? Are we like the puppet masters and the politicians are the puppets? And so whatever the politicians do is merely a sort of extended reflection of what we would do. So they're just a sort of an extension of our own thoughts and prejudices and weaknesses and foibles and all the rest of it. Now, some would argue, no, politicians are like a different species. They're sort of an elite group, and they don't reflect our views. They don't represent us. But they might reflect my views because I'm a ludicrously privileged Oxford academic, and so I'm part of this appalling liberal elite that's ruined the world and the country and all the rest of it. So, fair enough. But you might say, well, I can't vote as a young person. If you're under 18, you can't vote in national elections. So you might say, this is not in my name. These politicians are nothing like me. And you might sort of conceptually say that politicians are almost like a different species as far as you're concerned. So nonetheless, we have to have this conversation. What are politicians? Are they people that take difficult decisions that we wouldn't have the stomach to take? Are they taking bad decisions because we want them to take bad decisions? Or are they taking bad decisions because they are so far removed from accountability, they're so in the pocket of, I don't know, big business or whatever, that they don't need to listen to us anymore? So what's going on? We need to be careful and we need to be analytical. All right. Good. And there's more, right? I mean, there's so many layers to this question that we can think about. So when we say, why don't politicians do more? It begs the question, more than what, or more than who, or whom, right? How do you compare activity when it comes to climate change? It's a very difficult thing to quantify. Okay. And how can you work out some sort of metric or yardstick where you can say, well, Britain is doing X for climate change, but Denmark is doing 2 times X, or 2 plus X. What? This is so complicated to really pin down. And academics like clarity. We don't like this sort of generalization of saying, oh, I wish they would do more. That sort of appalling second person they, which is completely indeterminate, right? You hear this all the time. They should do something about the potholes. They should do something about this. They should do something about that. Who on earth is they? What are you talking about? Right? This is sort of the academic in me, which is basically a slightly more hygienic version of a toddler, just thinks, you're being so unclear. You've got to tell me what you're talking about, right? And in my Oxford interviews, when I'm interviewing prospective undergraduates, I constantly try and pin them down to make them more clear in their answers. So don't say something like they should do more about climate change. Tell us who you're talking about. Anyway, before I get too animated, here is a sense of better and worse performance when it comes to tackling climate change. Now, this is a ranking that was developed by the University of Yale in America. And you can see the top 10 best countries as regards climate mitigation or climate change mitigation, and the top worst countries when it comes to climate change mitigation. Okay. And it's a compound metric that they've used. So they're using lots of things such as investment in green technologies, carbon offsetting, divesting from fossil fuels, all these sorts of things compounded together to try and get a sense of who are the best and who are the worst players in the world. Okay. Now that's decent. I mean, it's a good, pretty rigorous study. So there's a lot to take from this. But you still need to be careful and critical. We can't just walk away from this and say, oh, right, well, so Denmark is the world's best country and Burundi is the world's worst country when it comes to climate change mitigation. I mean, one problem is, first of all, those metrics could be weighted differently. So there are certain things that you could do, say you could work out per capita, in other words, per individual in those countries. Maybe that would give us a very different picture. Denmark and Burundi are both quite small countries by population size. But somewhere like the US it's got a much bigger population. So maybe per head, it's actually doing far more. Okay. There's also that what I've already pointed out, which is called carbon offsetting, which is a huge problem. A country like Denmark will import products that utilize a lot of fossil fuels, but they just import that product supposedly clean into their territory. So when we try and adjudicate how well or badly a country is doing when it comes to climate change mitigation, what we do is we measure what's going on within that territory. What we don't do is try and work out what does the demand within that territory do to climate change. So if Danish people are demanding dirty products be manufactured in other countries, but then they just get shipped to Denmark, they are still contributing to climate change, but they just offset it somewhere else. Okay? So there's a really big difficulty in trying to work out who are the best players, who are the worst players, and therefore coming up with anything conclusive along the lines of why doesn't Britain do more about climate change? Okay, now so far all I've done is sort of thrown spanners in the works. I mean, if you want to get really pedantic, and I do love pedantry, you could even talk about what is the metaphor of tackling mean, right? But let's not, we're getting to a proper can of worms here. And we're not really helping progress this discussion. So it's relatively easy to just poke holes in someone's argument. What we need to do is now start to build something back up again. So there's some decent data suggests that the UK is kind of doing all right when it comes to climate change mitigation, but it's very far from the best. It wasn't in that top 10 at all. And then if you split up the UK, Wales is doing substantially better than England. So, we can try and work out why don't, say, English politicians do more to tackle climate change. So we can try and rebuild some sort of discussion here, even though my angry inner toddler has just torn apart the question a bit. Okay, well, let's try and sort of talk through the political economy of climate change. What are the costs of acting on climate change? I've already suggested that there are some difficulties for politicians to have a time horizon of anything longer than 5 years. So that's a fairly straightforward cost to consider. But let's go further into that. What are some of the costs of providing any public good? Now, for a start, you could say that climate change isn't the responsibility of politicians at all. It could be something that the private sector would be better off doing. If you look at something like the London Underground, when that was first built, the first London line in the London Underground was the Metropolitan line, and it was the first underground line anywhere in the world. And it was fully financed by the private sector. These days, we wouldn't expect private companies to perform that level of investment. And the Elizabeth line, which is Crossrail, is going to be opened in the next couple of years. That's almost entirely funded by the public sector. So one of the issues is whether or not this is in fact even a public good. Is climate change mitigation something that must be led by politicians? And one of the arguments that some people have, especially those that are more inclined to having a smaller government role in their lives, is that the minute that the state starts to invest in these sectors, it crowds out private sector investments. That actually there might be a great call for private money to try and tackle some of these problems, but the state is sort of muscling them out. So there's one issue that maybe the state doesn't do more because the state wants us, the private sector, to do more about it. Okay. There is also various externalities. So if the state does get involved, one of the externalities, that means that the side effects basically is, as I say, that private citizens get less involved. Another externality is that you can end up damaging certain other things that we value. We take something like nuclear power. Nuclear power is considered one of the solutions to climate change because it's a relatively clean way of powering our homes. But it does have various externalities. It can create nuclear waste and it creates a risk to a nuclear meltdown. So there are, no policy is value neutral. Whenever you decide on a policy, it's going to have some side effects. And you've got to try and work out whether the side effects are not bad enough to stop you from going ahead with the policy. There's also questions about optimization. What is the optimal policy when it comes to climate mitigation? Should we wear a sort of a really rough hair shirt and make our lives incredibly painful and difficult in order to obtain better outcomes? But the problem is we don't know what better or best outcomes even are. So it's very difficult to tell people you got to rein in your use of resources. You've got to start behaving more, because they'll sort of say, yeah, but what's the outcome? What's the impact we're aiming for? It's so indeterminate that you start saying to someone, rein in your expenditures, change your lifestyle, but you can't concretely tell them what that could lead to. So that's a difficulty as well for politicians. And then there's a more sort of foundational question about rationality. What is the rational thing for an individual politician, an individual citizen, or a group of citizens to do? Now, when we start talking about rationality, we're getting into the notion of game theory, which is a portion of economics. So economists try and work out through the use of games, what is the best strategy for a player to play in order to win that game? And there are some very famous examples of game theory that you may have heard of. So one is called the prisoner's dilemma, and the other is called the tragedy of the commons. And they can both help us understand why people don't do more to tackle climate change. So let's start with the prisoner's dilemma. The basic idea is that you've got two prisoners who are both being accused of conspiracy in a crime. So they've both been involved in the same crime, but they've been separated and they can't talk to each other. And under interrogation, they're basically encouraged to snitch on the other person. Now, what will happen is that if they both work together, although they can't communicate, if they both cooperate and refuse to snitch on each other, they'll get a relatively modest sentence. If one of them snitches and the other one says nothing, the snitcher gets off free and the one who says nothing gets a much longer sentence. If both of them snitch, they get a relatively long sentence. So you try and work out, you've got all of these different incentives. Do you snitch or do you keep silent? What would you do? The rational strategy, the best thing to do is to snitch on each other because you can't communicate. You don't know what the other prisoner is going to do. Your best bet is to assume that they'll snitch on you and therefore you have to snitch as well. Otherwise, you're going to be screwed. They'll go off free and you'll get a much longer sentence. So even though you both get punished, it's in your own interest to dob the other person in. Now, of course, we're assuming that there's no sort of moral code in this universe that you don't, snitches don't get stitches or whatever. So you're perfectly happy with the repercussions of snitching on your other person. But that is the rational thing to do, is to defect. Now, what has this got to do with climate change? Well, one of the implications of the prisoner's dilemma is that if we don't communicate with each other, if we don't have the institutional framework to help us understand what our own interests are and what other people's interests are, then the most rational thing for most individuals is to defect, is to say, I'm not going to cooperate because I don't know what the other person's going to do. They're probably going to screw me over. So I might as well just do what I want to do. Basically, without good institutions, people are selfish because that's rational, right? You need good institutions so that you can foster better communication. The way to resolve the prisoner's dilemma is to allow the prisoners to talk to each other or to have a repeated game so that they learn that once you snitch in the first game, you'll get punished in the second game. So multiple turns of that game will mean that the prisoners start cooperating more regularly. Okay, so this is what leads economists to advocate for good institutions, say on an international level or even on a domestic level, because they facilitate the exchange of information. They can allow players in the game to work out what's in each other's best interest. So they don't defect, they don't snitch on each other, they don't screw each other over. Okay, another insight of game theory is what's known as the tragedy of the commons. Now, what that suggests is that if you've got a common good, let's say like common ground that anyone can use for pasture land for their animals to graze on, or anyone can plant crops. They can do whatever they like with this common ground. The rational thing to do is to exploit that common asset to the fullest of your ability. So you go out every day, you farm that land to absolute kingdom come, right? And you just take everything from that ground until it's completely depleted as a resource. It's wasted. And everyone has the same incentive. So pretty quickly, that common ground that everyone has as a shared asset will just be destroyed because everyone will use it to the most of their ability. Hence the tragedy of the commons, because it's a tragic story. Ultimately, that common land will become useless. Okay. Again, that's the rational thing to do if there's no coordinating mechanism. If there's nothing to say to these people, whoa, if you all take as much as you can, this isn't going to last 5 years. So just cool your boots. All right. You get this and that's fair. You get that and that's fair. And we'll sort of start passing it out. In short, you need authority. You need power. And that power needs to be legitimate and respected so that when people try and use that common asset, they don't just steal or take as much as they can. So again, one of the implications of game theory is that you need strong, reliable, and legitimate institutions. And one of the problems that politics and politicians have faced in recent years is that there is a deficit of trust in institutions. So lots of individual citizens don't believe what politicians are doing within their best interests, and so they defect. Okay, so that's part of the issue when it comes to questions of game theory, rationality, and so forth. And that's just individual rationality. What about collective rationality? What if we go from you and me as single people and we extrapolate out to much larger groups and communities, what if we sort of increase the number to 2 or more people? Well, then you start to get into the area of the logic of collective action. Why do certain groups behave cooperatively and work together for common goals, whereas others do not? And relevant to this discussion, why do some groups work to mitigate climate change and its worst effects, whereas others don't? Okay. Now, you've probably heard of what's known as the free rider problem, and that's a really important part of this story. So what are the incentives for someone, let's say, to clean up a beach, to go to a beach, pick up all the rubbish, make it clean and beautiful? Well, according to economists, that's about as stupid a thing as you can possibly do. Now, economists, see the world in a slightly odd way, you could argue, but what they would say is, let's think about the costs and the benefits. If you go out and you clean a beach, the costs are highly concentrated. In other words, you have taken your time, your energy, your effort, and you've tidied up that beach. I mean, good for you, I guess. But the benefits of that are highly dispersed because you can't exclude people from the beach. It's not a private beach, so everyone can enjoy the fruits of your labor. And they will therefore have an incentive to free ride on your hard work. You've done all of this labor, you've busted a gut, you've cleaned the beach, it's all looking beautiful, and then all the punters come along and they just destroy it again. Right? So there's an epic free rider problem. You can't exclude people from the benefit of you beautifying the environment. But on the other hand, you've got these big fossil fuel companies that are exploiting fossil fuel resources at an extraordinary rate. So why are they so incentivized to go ahead and start fracking for gas in Lancashire, or trying to work out if they can drill for oil in the Northwest Passage in Canada? Well, for them, it's the other way around. The costs are highly dispersed because if they start releasing more CO2 into the atmosphere, everyone is going to bear that cost to a little extent. But the benefits are incredibly concentrated. They're going to make a freaking fortune out of drilling for gas, getting cheaper oil, blah-de-blah-de-blah. So that's one of the problems when we talk about the logic of collective action when it comes to tackling climate change. Why do groups like Greenpeace and other ecological activist organizations not have anything like the power of these huge oil companies? The economists would say, well, look at where the costs and benefits are, and which costs are dispersed and which costs are concentrated, and which benefits are dispersed and which benefits are concentrated. If you work in order to clean the environment, you have concentrated costs and dispersed benefits. If you work to destroy the environment, you have concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. And that's why people don't do more to tackle climate change, according to economists. Now, you could say, that's bollocks. Clearly it's more complicated than that. That would be a reasonable critique. Of course, these economic theories are just theories. They're just stories to help us try and work out what's going on in the world. There's obviously a lot of problems with it. As with any story, it's a crass simplification of reality, and the reality is much more complicated. But there's something to this, right? It's intuitive to work out, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Why are these oil companies so fabulously wealthy and they keep almost without any check, exploiting new fossil fuel resources, and these other people on the other side who are trying desperately to do something to clean it all up but not getting much headway. Okay. Now, one thing that's worth noting, of course, which is a crucial element in this whole story, is that exploiting fossil fuels is no longer the most economic way of producing energy. So in 2016, there was a crucial tipping point when providing electricity was no longer cheaper through fossil fuels than it was with renewables. Absolutely crucial turning point. Now, all of a sudden, the market has shifted the whole dynamic because now it's cheaper to provide renewable energy. And so you're no longer a bit of a fool if you go and exploit wind or solar power or waves or geothermal and so forth. Okay. Now you're looking increasingly a fool if you want to exploit coal, if you want to exploit gas, because you're basically taking a dirtier, more expensive, more dangerous option when you could go for a cheaper, cleaner option. And that's crazy. So that could be a crucial change to the calculus. This could massively accelerate climate change mitigation because the simple economic fact is that now it's cheaper to be green. And so everyone's incentives are going to start to align more towards green than to other approaches. Okay. Anyway, that's nonetheless a bit of the story about the sort of the rationality of climate change, the individual and the collective rationality. Okay, now what about the future? Okay, now one of the hugely complicated factors about this whole debate is about discounting the future. In other words, or discounting the present, you could say, for the sake of the future. So trying to work out how to value our present conditions relative to an indeterminate future. Okay, and I'm using the slightly sort of pompous Latin phrase cui bono, which means who wins or who benefits. Now, those two words are amongst the most useful to ever use in political science. Who wins in a situation? When you're trying to work out how power aligns in a particular relationship, ask yourself who's winning here, because that's basically the bread and butter of politics. All right. So when we talk about discounting the future, we're talking about how we work out who's going to benefit from climate change mitigation and who's going to bear the costs. Okay. And there are various sorts of interesting things to think about. One of which is what's known as the social discount rate. Now, what this means is that if there is going to be investment in any sort of green technology or any climate change mitigation, you have to calculate an amount by which you are discounting an investment in something completely different. So, for example, the UK Treasury sets the social discount rate at about 3.5%, 5%, something like that, meaning that they assume that they would make about 5% if they invested in, I don't know, private sector businesses, blue chip computing or something like that. Totally irrelevant to climate change. And so therefore your green investment has to be even more valuable than that for them to give the go ahead. Okay, so they have to work out a discount to work out economically whether or not it makes sense to invest in climate change mitigation or would make better sense to invest in something totally unrelated. The social discount rate for the US Treasury is closer to 7%. So in other words, their threshold is even higher. Their policymakers are saying, you've got to convince me that investing in wind or solar is so much more valuable than us investing in something completely unrelated that we will be convinced to go ahead with it. Now, this is clearly just an arbitrary line in the sand that's been made by policy wonks who live in, Washington or London, but it has an enormous impact. If the British Chancellor came out and said, we're going to set the social discount rate at a fat 0, the amount of investment in green technologies would go through the roof, because all of a sudden the public sector would have huge incentives to start plowing money into green technologies. This is a huge issue. It's very little known about, but it's one of the crucial checks on investment, and especially in places like America, where the social discount rate is so high that basically it's the US government saying, we're not interested unless there's an overwhelming case in favor of it. Okay, so that's one problem about discounting, is trying to do the calculations of who wins. Another thing to bear in mind is international cooperation. Now, when we spoke about the free rider problem and the collective action problem, well, it's a similar setup, but between countries. If you imagine countries are a bit like individuals, why do some countries cooperate and other countries defect? There's a massive incentive to free ride on the hard work of others. And frankly, we've seen this a lot in the last 4 years under the Trump administration. The incentive is to say, we're not going to sign up to the Paris Agreement. We'll let you idiots go and beautify the environment for us. We're going to do bugger all about it. In fact, we're going to start digging for more coal. We're going to churn out even more fossil fuels. And you idiots can do all the hard work. Thanks. Bye. Right? And there's nothing you can do about it. Okay. So America was epically free riding on the hard work of other people. And they're totally incentivized to do that. An economist who might look at the world in sort of very black and white cost benefit terms would say, congratulations, Donald Trump. You've done precisely the most rational thing. Now, of course, critics would say, yeah, but it's destroyed America's reputation. They've lost their leadership role in the world. It's made him look like a fool and a charlatan. And that's all, pretty much accurate. But at the same time, you can kind of understand why a politician like Donald Trump, especially given his voters, many of whom have been made vulnerable by globalization, many of whom perhaps rely on certain dirty industries, would want to say, nah, screw that. Let France and Britain and Belgium do all the hard work and we'll just carry on digging for coal but it's fine. So there's a sort of an international free rider problem, an epic international free rider problem. And that's why institutions like the Paris Climate Accords are so important. That's why COP26, which is the climate change conference in Glasgow next year, are so important. Because remember what I said about the prisoner's dilemma? You need mechanisms for communication. If you want to stop people defecting with each other, they need to know what each other wants. They need to have those lines of communication. And institutions and authority are crucial to stop this defection, to stop this free rider selfishness, frankly. Okay. Now, then the last problem is much more philosophical, and it has to do with intergenerational justice. Now, what that means is that you have to discount your own pleasure now for an indeterminate benefit to your ancestors in the future. Ancestors? Successors, sorry. So in other words, you have to take difficult steps to limit your pleasure of the world right now so that your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren won't face apocalypse. There's a lot of questions about whether or not that's just. So, for example, should you curtail the amount you fly overseas? We know that currently international airplane travel is amongst the most polluting activities we can do as an individual. So that puts a real burden on our carbon footprints, right? So should you basically have holidays at home so that your grandchildren can go globetrotting? Is that fair? Is that fair on you? What if you're not planning on having children or grandchildren? Do you see how the questions of justice aren't irrelevant? It may be that some people decide, well, I'm not planning on having children. I've got no stake in the future. Why should I care what other people's grandchildren get to do? If the world's heading towards apocalypse, let it run. I don't care. I've got no legacy. It doesn't matter. No, that might sound sort of outrageously flippant, but that's kind of the sort of tacit story that some people will be telling themselves. They'll just think, oh, screw this. Why am I discounting my pleasure now for some indeterminate pleasure for someone I've never met in the future that has no connection to me? Now, that might sound like an outrageously selfish perspective, but it's also arguably a position rooted in a theory of justice. Is it really fair that we now have to wear a hair shirt for someone else in the future? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I'm willing to do it because I guess I do have a stake. I've got two kids. And so I suppose you could say in a sort of selfish evolutionary perspective, I'm concerned for their well-being. I think there's more to it than that. I might be kidding myself, but I kind of think that as a species, we ought not to just destroy the earth that we're living on. In a sort of global sense of the tragedy of the commons, we're depleting the resources of the earth and we're tearing it to pieces. And I don't think that's moral or just either. I think we should do more to stop it. But, maybe I'm just naive. Maybe this is all just self-delusion. I don't know. But certainly, hopefully, you can see that politicians have a really hard time with navigating these things. Politicians have short time horizons. They have to face up to the reality that in some senses it's not rational to be doing that much about mitigating climate change because they'll just get punished if they try. They'll disrupt all of these stakeholders that are quite happily ensconced in currently behaving as they do behave, and they don't really want to change their lifestyle that much. They have to think about the questions of justice and fairness when it comes to sort of discounting the future in some sort of complicated way. There's all this potential for free riders. So if a politician in Britain decides to make the country pay far more in, let's say, fuel tax, but then, Americans just do nothing about it, it seems not very fair, does it? I mean, America is responsible for 25% of global carbon emissions. So if we in Britain have to all pay this massive road tax, how on earth is that fair? I can completely understand someone being a little bit disgruntled, especially if that person's not planning on having any children. They've got no connection to the future and they just think, what the hell? I don't get this. This is totally unfair. And they'll punish their politician for even trying to do more about it. So why don't politicians do more to tackle climate change? To be honest, for a long time, it would have been quite foolish for them to have done more about climate change. That's the grim truth. It may have been the more morally uplifting and just and righteous thing to do, but sadly, politics and politicians don't win through being righteous and just. They don't. They win by getting policies that get more votes and that are more popular. And that might sound monstrously depressing, but it's just realistic. And I think the key change in this whole debate, the thing that's going to completely upend the whole dynamic, is the fact that now green technologies are cheaper than fossil fuels. That is basically going to completely change the landscape. Thank God. That's going to be the real change that will matter. Now, of course, that begs the question, why did that process come about? And that is an interesting thing to think about. And that was partly to do with sustained investment from governments. It was due to sustained investment from private individuals as well. So part of the reason that these things have become cheaper has been in part because lots of money has been poured into universities, into research and development and things like that. So it's not like the state has done nothing, but it's maybe not made such a big song and dance about it. It's maybe not done traditional policy things such as setting taxes or spending lots of money. It's been doing a lot more sort of quiet stuff in the background that's had, over a long term, a big impact. Anyway, I'll leave it there.